Dr. Shapiro is a political philosopher, a critical theorist, and a cultural theorist who often works with film, literature, and aesthetics. His academic interests include political theory and philosophy, critical social theory, politics of aesthetics, and transdisciplinary methodologies, which are for him tools for making visible the micropolitics of urban life worlds. He earned his PhD from Northwestern University, and with a long and distinguished academic career, Professor Shapiro has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, University of Massachusetts, the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, and the University of Bergen in Norway. He is currently a professor at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and the Department of Political Science, where he teaches courses on identity politics, on political theory, and on the politics of visual culture. Dr. Shapiro's work has been called post-disciplinary, since he works with transdisciplinary methodologies and various traditions such as international relations, cultural studies, political philosophy, gender studies, and aesthetics. Among his recent books are Politics and Time, published in 2016, War Crimes, Atrocity, and Justice, published in 2015, The New Violent Cartography, published in 2014, Studies in Transdisciplinary Method, published in 2012, and of course, The Time of the City, published in 2010. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Michael Shapiro and his keynote address, When the Earth Moves Towards a Political Sublime.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks very much, Carolyn, to Francois and all the students already mentioned, so I don't have to go through the litany. I might have forgotten some. I'm very grateful for being invited, and I'm very much looking forward to this. As you see from the program, my title is When the Earth Moves Toward a Political Sublime. This is a draft of the first chapter of a book on the political sublime that's in press at the moment. I begin actually with an anecdote, but I want to give you the context. I'm watching the World Series in 1989, and in one of the innings, there's suddenly an earthquake, which hits San Francisco. The Bay Bridge collapses, play ends, and because I have a family, my sister, brother-in-law, and niece in San Francisco, I called to find out how things were. And my little niece, Hannah, who was 3 years old, got on the phone, and I said, "What was it like, Hannah?" And she said, "Very big." And I said, "How big?" And she said, "Too big for my daddy to hold," which was a perfect example, I think, of the sublime. So let me begin. Hannah's remarks accord with Kant's explication of the feeling of the sublime in his discussion of the interplay between apprehension and comprehension. That an encounter with the sublime precipitates, he refers to a breakdown that imperils comprehension. The first moments of one's apprehension of the sublime, something that's, in his words, absolutely great, an object or event, attenuate, because apprehension has reached a point at which the representation of sensuous intuition, in the case of the parts first apprehended, begin to disappear from the imagination as this advances the apprehension of yet others. And for the comprehension, we get a maximum of which imagination cannot exceed. Just as an aside, where Kant mentions part, this is really what enfranchises Deleuze's critique of Kant, because Kant never really tells us what constitutes a part, basically. Anyway, I go on to say that little Hannah was undaunted. As Kant would have it, the end to be attained, the presentation of a concept, i.e. the task from moving between apprehension and comprehension, is made harder to realize by the intuition of the object being almost too great for the faculty of apprehension, so that our faculty of imagination breaks down in presenting the concept of magnitude and proves unequal to the task. Hannah's imagination, although it was challenged, was in a way equal to the task of estimation. For her, the earthquake exceeded the estimation of size, which, when she submitted it to her primary unit of measure, that which her daddy was able to hold. Whereas for Kant, the unit of measure for subjective judgments is always our body, quote unquote. In Hannah's case, it can be another body, which is one of the things that fascinated me. So much for what Kant calls the mathematically sublime, which provides an initial analysis of what happens when something of vast magnitude challenges the imagination and sets the mind in motion. Turning to Kant's subsequent section, the dynamically sublime, we find him evoking fear. He suggests that an encounter with the sublime, for example, ravages of nature, strikes the untutored mind as terrifying. Doubtless anything too big for her daddy to hold was momentarily frightening for Hannah. However, according to Kant, once contemplation of the sublime proceeds, one achieves a level of satisfaction in the realization that however fearful nature can be, there's a sphere of the mind which altogether exceeds the realm of nature. For Kant, all his solutions have to do with the fact that the mind is greater than the world. Although she had apparently become satisfied about her safety after the quake hit, it's doubtful that the motions of Hannah's mind, which summoned her primary mediating authority, Daddy, led to such a realization, which would have fulfilled Kant's suggestion that the ultimate effect of the sublime is a recognition of one's freedom, and thus one's capacity for morality. That said, I want to consider what we can surmise about her subsequent encounters with the sublime. In the period beyond childhood, when the transition to adolescence and adulthood, in that transition, everything becomes too big for one's daddy to hold. When the insulation of the traditional patriarchal household loses its hold on the scope of a child's imagination, and the emerging adult must manage a world outside the home, one whose normative codes exceed the contained moral universe of the household, the interplay of apprehension and comprehension set off by sublime moments presents challenges that one cannot manage by turning to one's parents for reassurance. Reviewing Walter Benjamin's childhood writings, Burkhard Linder makes the case. From the child's point of view, this is a quote, "The world of adults appears to be as infinite as it is impenetrable," end quote. Just as the aging child is effectively thrust into a different world with different implications for managing the daunting forms of vastness that challenge comprehension, the same goes for aging fathers, who had once felt secure in their command of the moral spaces within and outside the household, at least for purposes of managing the traditional family's domestic and social worlds. They begin to lose their command capabilities as their mental agility and accordingly their ability to manage change, both practically and ideationally, attenuates. Such seems to be the case with the painter Albrecht Dürer's 70-year-old father in this scene. I was captivated by this picture years ago. As I walked through the National Gallery in London, I took one look at it, I left the room, and I kept coming back. Why? Because fortunately I had seen my father advance in age to this particular position. And if you look at first, this looks like an angry man. But when you look closely for a while, you can see that it's not anger, it's fear. At least that's my argument. As Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari suggest, the face is a veritable megaphone. A quick look at this face suggests that what is being broadcast is anger. However, a longer look yields a different impression. If we abide for a while with the image, we can see the fearfulness and the related querulous suspicion behind the anger of a man who's losing his grip and likely his moral authority as well. I'm a little bit troubled by my example because I'm now 7 years older than this fellow. Lacan develops a radical version of Freudian transference, which is relevant here, called foreclosure, a form of cutting that speaks to instances in which the place formerly occupied by an adequate father has been left empty and leads to a psychosis. As Lacan puts it, when the name of the father is foreclosed for a particular subject, it leaves a hole in the symbolic order which can never be filled. Nevertheless, a filling effort takes place, bracketing the issue of psychosis and pursuing what Lacan identifies as a subsequent search to fill the void. I turn to the place where Lacan asks, quote, "How can the name of the father be called by the subject to the only place in which it could have reached him and which it has never been," end quote. And he answers, simply by a real father, not necessarily the subject's own father, but by a father, end quote, i.e., I would say by an other, who serves as a substitute that can legislate and thus provide normative reassurance or solace for the subject. It can well be a mother rather than a father. As Lacan points out in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the play is dominated by the mother as other, and the authority import of much of, I would argue, Pedro Almodovar's films is captured by the title of one of them, which is All About My Mother. I think his films have always been all about my mother, in fact. However, focused on the situations in which the father really has the function of a legislator, according to Lacan, Lacan provides examples of those fathers who make the laws, posing, for example, as, quote, the pillar of faith, as a paragon of integrity and devotion, as virtuous or as a virtuoso, by serving a work of salvation or whatever object or lack of object, of nation or of birth, safeguard or of salubrity, of legacy or legality, all ideals that provide him with many opportunities of being in a posture of undeserving inadequacy, even of fraud. One of Lacan's examples, the pillar of faith, resonates with a scenario. I was going to show a clip, but it's gotten too complicated. This is Bergman's Winter Light, in which we have a minister, Thomas Eriksson, which makes a lot of sense for Bergson because, one, he's a doubting Thomas, and Bergson himself is Eric's son. His father was a minister. Okay. The protagonist of the film is a Lutheran minister who carries on with his liturgical duties and guidance functions even though he has lost his faith and is unable as a result to offer solace to a parishioner traumatized by what can best be described as the nuclear sublime. Tobias Wolff, a writer's summary, captures the essence of the moment. Thomas, a Lutheran pastor and widower, is suffering a crisis of faith, barely going through the motions of his ministry. One of his parishioners has become obsessed with the prospect of nuclear annihilation. At his wife's urging, the man, a fisherman, comes to the pastor for reassurance, some blessed word of hope that he can grasp as a lifeline. But Thomas can offer nothing but the bleakness of his own despair. The fisherman ends up committing suicide. Thomas Eriksson, played by Gunnar Bjornstrand's conversation with his parishioner Jonas Pedersen, Max von Sydow, who's traumatized because he's heard that the Chinese are so hate-filled that when they get the bomb, they'll destroy the planet, is an encounter of sublimes, Christian and nuclear respectively, both of which challenge comprehension. Both Thomas and Jonas, confronted with what Michel Foucault in a reflection on Lacan's concept of foreclosure calls the father's no, the pastor who is no longer able to take his role seriously cannot function as an adequate father because he has experienced a father's no. God the Father does not function as a father for him because of his silence. Thomas is therefore as afflicted as is Jonas. His God, a figure in a Lutheran version of the Christian sublime, will not reveal himself. After asking Jonas about his work, his health, his marriage, and a search for what afflicts him, he turns the focus on himself. Telling Jonas he will be frank with him, he proceeds to ramble on about his own despair. He says that he can no longer presume that the world he thought he shared with his paternal deity, he no longer can presume a world that he shares with his paternal deity. As he puts it, quote, my God and I resided in an organized world where everything made sense. I put my faith in an improbable, private image of a fatherly God, an echo God who gave benign answers and reassuring blessings, end quote, recalling that his late wife had helped him to patch the holes. It had nevertheless become clear to him that what was there in the place of the fatherly God is a void. He concludes that suffering is incomprehensible, so it needs no explanation, and ends with the remark, Jonas, there's no creator. Okay. Other figures. Certainly there have been other father surrogates that people have turned to in the face of the nuclear sublime. For example, Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb. Many in the U.S. found his policy advocacy and his design accomplishments reassuring. However, the father figure is but one among a wide variety of authorities, cultural, political, religious, and scientific, to which people have turned as they've learned to live with the bomb and other sublime objects and events. A variety of presumptive authority figures are the resort in sublime moments when, contrary to Kant's model, the result is not recognition of one's freedom, but rather failed attempts to manage disruption and unease, prompting individuals to seek affirmation or reassurance from authority figures. Aliquer Roseanne Stone supplies a conceptual frame for such structures in her analysis of the contemporary technological sublime, which, among other things, involves the emergence of what she calls a prosthetic sociality, in which a gap exists between one's physical body and one's disembodied subjectivity. In cyberspace, for example, where you are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. When, for example, communication processes disrupt so thoroughly that which constitutes a socially apprehensible citizen, the form of reassurance, you suggest, is an act of warranting, through which the political apparatus of government is able to guarantee the production of stable concepts of citizenry. Although alternative cultural authorities weigh in to provide warrants for the coherence of the self for subjects who have technological extensions, it's primarily governmental authority, according to Stone, that answers the call for reassurance in the face of a technological sublime that challenges a subject's socio-political presence to itself and at the same time warrants the existence of community. In light of the contemporary shift in the nature of civic space from a predominantly public space to congeries of spaces increasingly privatized, Stone's reflections on the technological sublime provides an opening for a consideration of the political context of sublime objects and events, suggesting that sublime episodes occasion turbulence among communities of sense, which can either reveal or reorient authority figures. And I return to that concept of community of sense, which is a lot of the political part of my analysis. And so I have a fairly dense section I'll try to get through called The Sublime: Language and the Critique of Representation. The appearance of a sustained speculation on the sublime precedes the well-known Kantian version by many centuries. It originates with Longinus, likely writing in the 1st century, for whom the sublime is articulated through language. Sublimity, he writes, is a kind of height and conspicuous excellence in speeches and writing. And excellence, he adds, that manifests itself not through mere persuasion, but through originality that makes everything different, like lightning, and directly shows that all at once capability of the speaker. For Longinus, the sublime inheres in the extraordinary adequacy of words and rhetorical structures, which provoke amazement and wonder as well as influence, functioning to prompt the hearer to think beyond what is heard. Sublime expressions in speech and writing linger. They leave deep in one's mind more to theorize than what was actually said, according to Longinus. However, eloquence can have its perils. Longinus cautions against making one's figuration too unconcealed, lest the effect be dangerous. If one's figures are too obvious, they imply insinuation and deception. Fake news, which might make somebody who was able to make a decision, for example, a king or a tyrant, angry, for such a man may regard them as an insult and go completely wild, or able to prevail over his rage, firm himself entirely against the persuasiveness of the speech or writings. It sounds awfully relevant, doesn't it? Centuries later, Jean-Paul Sartre offered a view of the dangerously powerful effect of words. They can wreak havoc. Les mots font de ravage. Words wreak havoc, he said in his biography of Flaubert. The danger to which Sartre was referring was occasioned by the word love in Stendhal's novel The Charterhouse of Parma, which, if mentioned in a relationship between a young man and his aunt, the character Count Moscow, the Prime Minister of Parma, says, "If the word love is pronounced between them, I'm lost. It would provoke a censorious community of sense." The concept of community of sense looms large. Here I want to note that the contemporary approach to words and analysis of the sublime contrasts with the approach of Longinus. For Longinus, words are either adequate and inspiring or inadequate because of a failed use of figures and or selections, i.e. composition. The contemporary post-Burkean, post-Kantian word-sublime relationship is quite the reverse. Since Burke and Kant, rather than being awe-inspiring, words fail in the face of the sublime. They become inadequate rather than being sublime. As one commentator puts it, in broad terms, whenever experience slips out of our conventional understanding, whenever the power of the object or event is such that words fail and points of comparison disappear, then we resort to the feeling of the sublime. As is the case for representation. Whether resident in Longinus's observations or in contemporary post-Kantian ones, what is shared by sublime experiences and disruptions to representation is a provocation to think critically about subjectivity. For purposes of illustration, I engage two examples, one art historical and the other cinematic. The former is George Didi Huberman's analysis of a disruption of representation in an anti-iconographic analysis of Vermeer's paintings, pointing to patches of color that disrupt depiction and thus disturb representation by being an intrusion. He refers to a catastrophic commotion in the canvases that turns the viewer away from the image's reference and toward the artist's subject, and thereby to the very act of painting. Similarly, in an analysis of Gus Van Sant's recreation of Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho, Van Sant's Psycho 1998, Chelsea Crawford suggests that cinematic quotation interrupts the linearity of the text, and that the break with mimesis constitutes an interruption that fractures the mind of the viewer, turning his or her attention to the subject director's cinematic production, the mechanical sources within the diegesis, instead of toward the material objects captured in the image itself. Okay, a section I now call From Object to Subject. The shift in perspectives that Didi Huberman's analysis of Vermeer's canvases from the painting's reference, what is depicted, to the painting's production, to the painting's subject, and Crawford's analysis of Van Zant's cinematic quotation from the materiality of the image to the director's filming mechanism aligns itself with Kant's primary contribution in his Analytic of the Sublime, a frame for thinking about the dynamics of a disrupted subjectivity, which has since been rendered more dislocated and divided in post-Kantian analyses. As Heidegger famously puts it in his identification of Kant's philosophical contribution, Kant changed the question from what is a thing to who is man, i.e. to the subject. And by the time Kant gets to the Analytic of the Sublime, that subject is in disarray. So much so that Kant's aim of illustrating subjective finality is threatened. However, already in Longinus's treatise on the Sublime, subjectivity was rendered critically divided already. As Jean Milback points out, with Longinus, the discourse on the Sublime was concerned not only with the manifestation of singular individuals, but with the elevation of the individual above himself, often in circumstances which pose a threat to his own survival. Crucially, the threat of the Sublime for Kant involves a tension between faculties within the subject, between the faculty of imagination and the faculty of reason. In an encounter with the Sublime, which is boundless, unlike objects of beauty which have definite boundaries, there's a momentary check to the vital forces, followed at once by a discharge of the more powerful, and so it is an emotion that seems to be no sport, but dead earnest in the affairs of the imagination. That's a quote. Importantly, what is evoked is a more intense emotion than earnestness. The feeling of the Sublime is at once a feeling of displeasure, arising from the inadequacy of the imagination and the aesthetical estimation of magnitude to attain to its estimation by reason. End quote. Ultimately, the Sublime threatens Kant's ethico-political project of warranting a sensus communis. He notes that unlike the case of judgments of taste, for which we can expect subjective necessity, i.e. judgmental consensus, Sublime experiences threaten such an accordance. Beautiful nature, he writes, contains countless things as to which we can at once take one as in their judgment concurring with our own, and as to which we may further expect this concurrence without facts finding us far astray. But in respect of our judgment of the Sublime in nature, we cannot so easily vouch already acceptance by others. Unlike the effect of encounters with the beautiful, which occasion a feeling of satisfaction that one's mind participates in a universality of sense, in the case of the Sublime, the mind experiences a negative pleasure. Initially confounded, it quickly experiences an inner accord, achieving the modest pleasure of agreement among faculties, having thus coped with displeasure. Deleuze effectively characterizes this discordance that Kant attributes to Sublime experience. It is, quote, explained by the free arrangement of reason and imagination, but this new spontaneous agreement occurs under very special conditions, he says, pain, opposition, constraint, and discord. Okay. The question I then raise is, how does Kant save the sensus communis in the face of the Sublime? If we heed an extension of the passage above, beginning with beautiful nature and ending with Kant's admission that we cannot easily vouch for the acceptance by others, in the case of the Sublime, we find him turning to the concept of culture, a far higher degree of culture, not merely aesthetic judgment also, but also of the faculties of cognition, operating in the realm of the practical, which lie at the basis, seems to be the requisite to enable us. Okay. What he does is basically he recurs to his second critique, in which he finds an agreement, a sort of a normative consensus on morality. And so his solution to the problem of the Sublime is an ethical solution. Kant's evocation of the practical is the key to his strategy for rescuing the inevitability of a sensus communis. To restore the subjective necessity that he sees as threatened by the sublime, he recurs to the second critique. Here's how I put it elsewhere. To finesse the seeming recalcitrance of the sublime to subjective necessity that his critique of judgment is designed to establish, Kant turns to the concept of culture, which for Kant turns out to consist in the sharing of a natural moral sensibility, which can unite those who are refined enough and those as opposed to those who have a vulgar cultural sensibility. For Kant, the overcoming of the initial fear occasioned by the sublime, which he details in his section, The Dynamically Sublime, is doubtless influenced by Edmund Burke's emphasis on the terror produced by the sublime. Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That's Burke. While Burke and Kant are very much in accord with respect to the emotions occasioned by the experience of the sublime, they depart in their approach to what is occasioned in individual encounters with the sublime can contribute to a sensus communis. For Burke, among what people share is a passion for self-preservation, what he deems the strongest of all passions. As a result, insofar as a community of sense emerges from the terror of the sublime for Burke, it is Hobbesian. It is based on like-mindedness, the collective resonances of the security-seeking passion, the drive to avoid danger, although Burke also sides with the Scottish Enlightenment and talks a lot about sympathy here and there. Ultimately, in Kant's analysis of the sublime, Burke's self-preservation is replaced by the awareness of our transcendent freedom and moral vocation. Although that replacement seemingly constitutes a move from the empirical to the a priori level, its effects can be empirically illustrated, as many post-Kantians have shown. And so I have a section which I talk about the move from the ethical to the political, post-Kantian political philosophy. Kant's contemporary Friedrich Schiller is among those who have sought to extend Kant's analytic of the sublime into an ethico-political perspective. Absorbing both Kant's and Burke's analysis of the sublime, Schiller's emphasis is on the political unconscious of the aesthetic of terror, which he presumes to be suppressed for subjects to be able to achieve active mastery over it rather than allowing ourselves to be passively overcome by it. In his earlier essay on the sublime, he modifies Kant's distinction between the mathematical and the dynamically sublime and heeds Burke's emphasis on the drive to self-preservation, referring instead to the theoretical and practical sublimes respectively. With a theoretical sublime, nature stands as an object of cognition, in opposition to the conceptual drive. With a practical sublime, it stands as an object of feeling in opposition to the preservation drive. He adds, quote, the theoretical sublime contradicts the conceptual drive, the practical sublime contradicts the preservation drive. Insofar as there are political moments in those contradictions, which for Schiller involves minds realizing themselves in their capacity and independence, they involve an epistemological epiphany, a grasp that overcomes initial lack of comprehension, and a more active posture, which Schiller deems as resistance to fear. In both cases, as Schiller does a second take on the sublime 8 years later, the sublime procures for us an exit from the sensuous world, rather suddenly and through shock. Summoning a historical example and a mythological one, he refers to Hannibal's Alps-crossing feat and Prometheus's lack of regret for his deed. Schiller constructs the subject as sublime. Sublimity inheres in the individual subject that overcomes mere instinctual fear, in a practical sense, by managing misfortune. In effect, sublime subjects evince the moral person within. Ultimately, Schiller's historically attuned reflections on the sublime, in which he reviews moments of violent conflict, fashion what Hayden White refers to as a historical sublime, which he, White, sees as authorizing a totally different kind of politics, one which promotes Schiller's account of aesthetic education to allow for a mastery over the deeply indifferent energy of the historical process. In other words, achieving agency. Apart from his resistance to Kant's formalistic abstractions, Schiller turns from mere structures of apprehension to the cognitive dynamic that moves from apprehension to comprehension, to historically attuned examples of sublime subjective enactments. His most significant contribution to a politics of the sublime lies in his turn to the role of the arts in aesthetic education. His last gloss on the sublime articulates the position extended by many neo-Kantian analyses in their turns to the arts. For Schiller, the arts, for example, Greek tragedies, provide pathetical portraits of inhuman wrestling with fate, of the irresistible flight of good fortune, of deceived security, of the tragic art through imitation that brings something to our eyes. In addition to providing an opening to the way the arts can instruct about sublime experience, Schiller introduces historical contingency, which both undermines the Kantian pursuit of subjective harmony and anticipates the analyses of post-Kantians who emphasize the contingencies of relations between subjects and communities of sense. Contemporary post-Kantian critique. Much critically oriented post-Kantian thinking resists Burke's, Kant's, and even Schiller's metapolitical versions of a sensus communis, notions of shared sensibility, whether empirical or a priori noumenal, as bases for a threshold for thinking about the conditions of possibility for political community. The tendency instead has been to focus on discord, dissensus, to evoke Jacques Rancière's term, framed by a thoroughgoing rejection of perspectives that essentialize human sensibilities. That rejection is best epitomized, I think, by Foucault's remark, quote, "Nothing in man, not even his body, is sufficiently stable to serve as a basis for self-recognition or for understanding other men," end quote. And Deleuze further destabilizes subjectivity by rejecting the transcendental version of a preformed or prefigured subject, displacing it with a dynamic process of subjectivity that is historically contingent, a series of subject formations and responses to events. Nevertheless, the legacies of late 18th century versions of the sublime continue their relevance. For example, Rancière, despite his steadfast resistance to Kant's and Schiller's commitments to subjective harmony, shares Schiller's view of the political efficacy of the arts. Like Hegel, however, in a wholly different way, Rancière renders the implications of the sublime by allocating its effects to artistic compositions and texts. However, in contrast to Hegel, who located the sublime effect in spiritual arts, Rancière turns to secular artistic texts whose effects he sees as reallocations of sensation. He notes, for example, that while literature does not do politics by providing messages or framing representations, it does so by triggering passions. In accord with that strategy, as I proceed with my analysis of contemporary, my emphasis will be on the artistic genres that reference the sublime or provoke sublime experiences. They inspire ways to shape a political comprehension that is negotiated within the events in which communities of sense emerge. In effect, what I'm suggesting is that the Kantian temporality has it wrong. It's not this immediate move from apprehension to comprehension. In that space, there's a negotiation in which the arts participate. In my analysis of the investigations I follow, I'm going to skip that section. I have chapters on the racial sublime, the nuclear sublime, the industrial sublime, and the terror sublime, which I was about to say something about, but I'm going to skip all that. The political or perhaps metapolitical contribution, I'm talking about Lyotard at this point, that Lyotard's thinking lends to a politics of the sublime, adheres as much in the poesis of his writing as in his explicit and quite equivocal attitudes toward a sublime political relationship. For example, he figures Kant's transition from the analytic of the beautiful to the analytic of the sublime as a disrupted economy and a broken betrothal, whereas the beautiful is a sentiment that proceeds from a fit between nature and mind, i.e., when transcribed into Kant's economy of faculties, between the imagination and the understanding. This marriage, or at least this betrothal, proper to the beautiful, is broken by the sublime. With that figuration, Lyotard opens a space of deferment. In his analytic of the sublime, Kant ultimately reduces the experience of the sublime to a brief moment in which the failure of the imagination is overcome by the engagement of the faculty of reason, and this negative pleasure of having overcome discordance creates the condition of possibility for the moral consensus. In contrast, Lyotard, like many philosophical contemporaries, affirm the first moment, but defer or avoid the second, substituting ongoing discordance for Kant's reason-enabling resolution. As I put it elsewhere, evoking Lyotard's marriage metaphor, reason, which is the dominant faculty in this analytic, derives moral concepts through imitation. It takes the sensible nature nothing more than pure reason can think of on its own, resulting through mind-nature marriage may be temporarily annulled in the encounter with the sublime, with Kant's summoning of the culture as moral sensibility. Second, a remarriage takes place. As Kant retreats from the more radical implication of the sublime, it challenges the idea of a naturally engendered common sense. Thus, Kant's retreat from the disruption occasioned by the sublime experience recurs to a shared morality. I'm going to skip a passage here. Lyotard's primary reinflection of Kant involves the substitution of the matter of art for Kant's transcendental structure of mentality in order to show how the nuances of the arts, the nonsense of thought, timbers, nuances, which are always being born, extend the sublime moment by taking it beyond both language and mentality. I want to extend that substitution in a way by conceiving politics of the sublime event by focusing on the way various artistic texts turn events into historical negotiations. Let me check my time here. The historicity of those negotiations become evident if one heeds Deleuzian temporality. Deleuze, like Kant, privileges the instant. However, that privileging is not in the service of moral closure. It is rather in the service of an imagination of a different future. For Deleuze, the event is an instant that articulates the maximum time of the incident with a minimum time of the incident with a maximum time of unlimited duration in order to make the instant all the more intense, taut, and instantaneous, since it expresses an unlimited future and an unlimited past. The pure instant, grasped at the point at which it divides itself into a future and a past. Okay. I have another dense, long section on this, but I'm going to skip to some actual examples. Heeding Deleuze's ethics of the event, particularly his suggestion that an event is a pure instant grasped at the moment which divides it into the future and past, I turn briefly here to the writer Don DeLillo's responses to the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, because his accounts are comparable to and illustrative of the temporality that Deleuze attributes to events. In an essay published roughly 2 months after the attack, DeLillo gives the event a simultaneous future and past. He suggests that on the one hand, the old world narrative of the domination of capital markets and uncontrolled investment potential has been overcoded by what happened in 9/11. Quote, today the world narrative belongs to terrorists, and as a result, this catastrophic event changes the way we think and act moment to moment, week to week, for unknown weeks and months and to come and steely years, end quote. On the other hand, inasmuch as, quote, the terrorists of September 11 want to bring back the past, we have to ask what grievances have been brewing, to which he answers, quote, it was America that drew their fury. It was the high gloss of our modernity. It was the thrust of our technology. It was our perceived godlessness. It was the blunt force of our foreign policy. In response to the world-shaking event of the 9/11 event, DeLillo fashions two accounts. First, in his Harper's essay, he urges us, quote, to invent a new future. Quote, the narrative ends in the rubble, and it's left to us to create a counter-narrative. Okay. I have a long section on Falling Man. I'm going to skip that. I'm going now to the bookends of my analysis, and this is another earthquake event. My return here to the sublimity of earthquakes is to examine the aftermath of the Kobe earthquake, figured in a collection of stories by Haruki Murakami. As for the impact of the quake, in the early morning hours of January 16, 1995, a 7.2 earthquake hit the port city of Kobe, Japan, killing over 5,000 people, causing billions of dollars worth of damage, and putting 300,000 people out of their homes, including the parents of Haruki Murakami. In entitling his set of stories after the quake, all of which are obliquely connected to the event, Murakami creates an encounter of temporalities. The temporality of the sublime moment, as apprehension moves toward comprehension, is followed by the temporality of the quake's after effects, the enduring trauma, which, like the quake itself, is metaphorically subterranean, i.e., not available to explicit discursive reference. Kathy Carruth captures the subterranean temporality of such traumas. Quote, the wound of the mind, the breach of the mind's experience of time, self, and world, is not like the wound of the body, a simple healable event, but rather an event that is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it imposes itself again repeatedly in the nightmares and repetitive actions of the survivor, end quote. As I noted, it's primarily government authority that's a resort for those seeking reassurance in the face of events that challenge the socio-political presence to themselves. In the case of the Hanshin earthquake centered in Kobe, after the government's response turned out to be inadequate, the authorities in Tokyo treated the problem as organizational, a need for more rapid response and for structural improvements. Quote, an emergency transportation network was devised, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to skip the governmental report here. Murakami provides a phenomenology of the event for Japanese who experience the quake. He enacts the phenomenologies, extends the sublime a moment of the quake, using his stories to defer and diversify comprehension and the modes of self-recognition it occasions, articulating it through a whole variety of kinds of lives. Metaphorically, he juxtaposes those different modes of comprehension in the civic sphere, belonging to the communities of sense, to the little people, to the state's attempt to contain understandings. What he does is he has it register an event-provoking awareness in individual lives. For example, in his first story, UFO in Kushiro, the quake is experienced by the nameless wife of Komura, who's transfixed, quote, for 5 straight days in front of the television, staring at crumpled banks and hospitals, unresponsive to her husband's voice. Ultimately, when her initial shock and confusion turn to comprehension, she recognizes the emptiness of her marriage, having often left for long intervals to visit her family. This time, 5 days after the earthquake, she leaves permanently, leaving behind a letter, quote, I'm never coming back. The problem is that you never give me anything. Or to put it more precisely, you have nothing inside me that you can give me. Living with you is like living with a chunk of air, end quote. The life-unsettling reaction to the quake of Murakami's character after she experiences an epiphany about her marriage is one of the few Flitcraft moments in Murakami's story. I'll briefly mention in Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, there's a Flitcraft parable in the middle. Sam Spade is talking to Bridget O'Shaughnessy, and he tells a story about how a man named Flitcraft is walking along the sidewalk one day. A beam falls from a building, hits the sidewalk, a chunk of concrete hits him in the cheek. And he has this epiphany. Life is unsponsored. Right? And so he starts another life in another city. And one asks, why such a parable in the middle of the story? Well, you have to understand where Dashiell Hammett fits in the kind of a genealogy of crime stories. The detective doesn't restore normality to society. There is no normality, right? Everything is contingent. And then he goes on with the story after the parable. Anyway, despite the focus on jarring effects, the emotional aftershocks of the quake on those in Murakami's story who had supposed they had sensibly ordered their lives, like the aftershock and complete dramatic changes in their life by the nameless wife. His focus is also on Japan's cultural reaction as a whole. In his quake stories, as in his ethnography of our own Shinriko gas attacks on the Tokyo passenger trains, it's clear that one of Murakami's goals is to force the Japanese to see themselves, an attempt to present what has been a traumatized population unpresentable, to attempt to capture the event of the trauma in language. Seeing denial and avoidance as intrinsic to much of the Japanese reaction to the quake after its initial apprehension of the effects, Murakami evokes the evanescence of quake images. Recalling Inarritu's rendering of the 9/11 image, I have a section there's 11 9/11 stories in film. One of them is Inarritu's, and all you see is a blank canvas. You see nothing for a while, and then suddenly a few images of falling body, and it goes black again, and so forth. That's more or less how he represents the World Trade Center attack in 11 minutes. To appreciate how his stories work, we have to heed both Murakami's testimony about his experience of the aftermath of the quake and his ethnography of the perpetrators and victims of the gas attack. He testifies that he traveled back and forth to his former city to witness the earthquake's shadow, to make sense of both the event and the sarin gas attack by creating a corridor connecting the two, seeing both events as simultaneously physical and psychological. pointing out in his Underground, which is about the sarin gas attacks, how workings of memory displace historical events, transforming trauma into an alternative narrative. Murakami writes, simply put, our memories of experiences are rendered into something like a narrative form. The truth of whatever is told will differ, however slightly, from what actually happened. This, however, does not make it a lie. It is unmistakably the truth, albeit in another form. Seeing a tension between personal memory and official history, Murakami has his fictional subjects experience a schism between the psychoanalytically determined subject and the subject of history. Specifically, to summon the psychoanalytic subject requires a summons to Freud's version of sublimity, and I'm going to skip that, but anyway, it's part of the chapter. Okay, I've spoken for quite a while. I'm going to go just to the last couple of stories. I have a quote here from Rancière, which fits the last part of the stories I'm talking about. A community of sense is a certain cutting out of space and time that binds together practices of visibility, patterns of intelligibility, derived from cutting out a partition of the sensible. Above all, it's made from some spatial setting. And there are two such civic spaces in Murakami's earthquake stories, both of which are drawn from earlier periods of his personal life. One is a gathering around a bonfire at a beach. Quote, as a child, I'd sneak out of the house at night and go to the sea with my friends and gather driftwood and light a bonfire. In the story, Landscape with Flatiron, the two characters, Junko and Mayaki, experience the bonding effect of a beach bonfire, which for both of them expresses the freedom they've experienced in their own Flitcraft moments, the breaking out of their former life worlds. At one point, Junko says, tell me, Mr. Miyake, when you see the shapes of what the bonfire makes, do you ever feel kind of strange, i.e. uncanny? To which he responds, it's like all of a sudden you get a very clear feeling about something that people don't usually notice in everyday life. Okay. The second civic space is musical. Doubtless drawn from Murakami's lifelong association with jazz, which began in 1964 when he was 15. He subsequently opened his own jazz bar and has since wondered if it might be possible to transfer his music into his writing. The improvisational rhythms of jazz performances have resonances in Murakami's writing, in which he has sought to represent events that defy representation within conventional discursive practices. For example, the jazz idiom surfaces in one story called Thailand, with which Murakami seeks to depart from everyone who has ever been brought up, every soul whose reflexes and mind have been duly normalized, and knows how to discipline essentially heretical, dissonant, and perverse voices. He adds, I'm going to skip this section. I have a long riff on a jazz experience to sort of make sense of it, but I'm going to skip that. Conclusion, the last story. Another small girl confronts an earthquake. In the last story that articulates his musings on post-earthquake Japan, called Honeypie, Murakami figures the divide between denial and comprehension with yet another figuration, a contrast between confining things in small boxes and liberating things for creative thinking. The story brings my analysis to full circle because one of the characters is a small girl named Sala, trying to make sense of a very large earthquake. She tells her mother, Sayoko, that she's been afflicted by a bad dream about a man who summons her, the earthquake man. He came and woke me up. He said he has a box ready for everybody. He said he's waiting with the lid open. The main character, Junpei, a writer, likely a stand-in for Murakami, has renewed a romantic relationship with Sayoko, having replaced her former husband. Junpei supplies the antidote for the confining box. His remarks about his vocation end the story and the collection as a whole. Quote, I want to write stories that are different from the ones I've written so far. I want to write about people who dream and wait for the night to end, who long for the light so they can hold the ones they love. But right now I have to stay here and watch over this woman and this girl. I'll never let anyone, not anyone, try to put them in that crazy box, not even if the sky should fall or the earth should crack open with a roar. My last paragraph. Here, Murakami's art of storytelling is his challenge to the way a politically attentive approach to a historical event can challenge Japan's cultural quiescence. its attempt to approach historical comprehension by confining the event within a small box, i.e. within conventional discursive frames. To summon Lyotard's terms, Murakami stories bear, quote, expressive witness to the inexpressible, end quote, while at the same time attempting with what fiction at its best can do, the creation of an altered, often oppositional community of sense. They exemplify the political sublime. And that's it.